Hello everyone, today we talk about the birth of universities, very broadly and generally without getting too specific or detailed, but just to give an idea of how the phenomenon basically was born and spread and structured at the end of the day, because essentially today this is an institution that has become, the most recognized and praised educational institutions that have taken that form and those means and those standards worldwide. But objectively, at the time, at least today, we will talk about medieval Europe specifically. It was something very new, and it emerged very, very spontaneously in many ways. High educational centers were present also in other civilizations. Muslim world had great centers of studies, etc. In Europe, there are certain specific characters that make it perhaps more, let's say, starting from the bottom society, not strictly meant in the sense of the poor people, but let's say emerging in parallel with two actually structures that already existed, such as capitular schools or cathedral schools, basically, that were ecclesiastical institutions, right, of learning that were attended, telling the truth, also by the laymen, right? These were open to laymen that the same ecclesiastical elites and administration actually needed to do a lot of things. This is true actually also for the monasteries, etc. This is not just about the secular clergy. It was a broader, like, we made a lot of videos about education in the early Middle Ages. This was very open, right? Of course, over time, and this is valid also for universities as lay institutions, and this is one very important characteristics in this regard, that albeit emerging very spontaneously, being very open, at one point they kind of crystallized in a certain form that was essentially the official cultural voice of the elites of the Ancien Regime, and therefore it kind of took a certain form that is also closer and more similar to the one we know today. And this is valid not just as system of education, and objectively was very different from what we are used to think at the beginning, right? The beginnings were actually like private business. It was just someone you wanted to get schooled in law, because that's, by the way, how it was born prevalently. You just pay someone to teach you, and that's literally, if you congregate with one or more people, that already becomes a university. And that's the concept behind all this. The same name of university actually is the universitas, that in Latin is, and at the time in the kind of universal language of formal education in Europe, was actually not just, it didn't indicate an educational institution. It meant basically any type of institution, right? The universitates were essentially even, the corporations, the guilds, certain groups, professional associations, and that was the name. And which is very correct, because etymologically speaking, it's universitas, from which even the same universe comes from, means something that is oriented versus, that means towards a single unicum, right? Unique aim, right? So there are people who get together just to achieve a common purpose, right? And in this case, the universities, of course, evolved into something different that we decided to attribute the specific name to, but that effectively were framed within a social system that was largely organized in the same exact way. The university, in this sense, was not conceived as a kind of empty institution or infrastructure or system that had to be filled by people who go there and then come out, like it is today, right? It was the university conceived as like an institution of people that made it as such. And of course, in the spirit of university, today it's technically the same, but it owes much, and this is an important thing, to how this concept in fact developed from the Middle Ages onwards, right? So more importantly, we have to remember that in the 11th and 12th century, where universities start being founded, the Latin term universitas designed especially every organized community, but also a community that was provided with its own juridical status. This is very important, also because universities were founded chiefly to study law at the time, right? There were also theological centers, but the greatest activity in actual research and intellectual development revolved around chiefly socio-economical activities that require to be disciplined by law. So having your own juridical status was very, very important in medieval law, because the world was effectively ruled by customs, by local customs. So having a juridical status simply meant that you created your own identity, your own right, and that in a certain sense the authorities were obliged to recognize it by your own. Naturally, there was a lot of political bargaining and negotiations, but of course who had the power to create a university on its own as a community? Well, this could really make the difference and definitely alter that negotiation and bargain, right? And we'll see why, for example, these activities were largely born in Italy, where there was a decentralization of political power, for which the local communities were to organize themselves on their own, while eventually eventually the institution spread as more guided or more channeled or more sanctioned by also the universal authorities, the emperor, the papacy, right, that were trying at that point, more than founding universities on their own, actually to sanction, like to protect and to take from their own side communities that by themselves already existed, right, and that they had at that point just to formally recognize. There were naturally communities that were that were at that point recognizing themselves by themselves, right, and that was normal too in the Middle Ages, and that's what we were talking about before, that these universities basically spread in the way that they wanted, and this is something that went on for a long time, even up to, think about the end of the Middle Ages, the University of Wittenberg, etc., how important for those intellectual and religious movements that these, even certain currents of spontaneous intellectual research and activity were for changing effectively the history of Western civilization. So it's very interesting to look at the beginnings of these institutions as well, right? So as we were saying before, the universities of the masters and the students that were the ancestors of our own universities were born together with associations of other type, such as the universitates, formed by people that carried out the same craft, or meant also inhabited the same town, the same village. This is very important to bear in mind. The political character of the university as well, that wasn't of course relegated just to the educational field, but the universities could have a political, even a military meeting, telling the truth. It was full of associations in here that were of military character, for example. Sometimes they had different names that were kind of a bit more, totemic in ideal, but let's say the concept is that these, especially these more opened groups that were evidently also being born from necessities that up to the previous centuries had not existed, educationally speaking, to adopt it. But the most important thing to remember is that in every case, universities developed spontaneously, right? They were stimulated essentially by the same necessity to defend themselves from the external and to organize themselves from the within. And it's not a surprise that this period saw the development, for example, and the birth, actually, of the communes, for example, or also in very different contexts, the ecclesiastical one, spiritual one, say better, of the brotherhoods, right? So it was a shared model of, of view of the world. It was not a specific model, institutional model, but it was what essentially those new political and social groups were feeling like, that they belonged to something, and deciding to create more, to structure it, to organize it, to administer it in a more functional way. And if spontaneity was a common trait, common feature of university, there were, however, different the developments of the various institutions at the beginning of their existence, right? As, for example, the comparison of the events of Bologna and Paris can show, right? For example, even if the origins are usually pretty unknown, and fundamentally we can just speculate on it, it seems demonstrated that at Bologna, for example, the initiative started from students that were largely lay people that aggregated in societies at the end of paying a master that could read and explain to them the ancient laws of the Romans, right? That is the Corpus Juris Civilis of Justinian and the Theodosian code from which it came from. So this is very important because it makes you understand that there were actually masters that weren't just, unemployed wandering around. Actually, there were ecclesiastical centers of learning, of higher learning, that evidently were starting to get interested in law as well. We made a video in this regard about Irnerius from Bologna himself, that seemingly had very strong connections at the time of the investiture controversy with the ecclesiastical elites, and he was probably, or was possibly, let's say, an ecclesiastic himself. So the university is born, seemingly, not much from these individuals that already had a job on their own, they already taught to someone, chiefly in the ecclesiastical field, but by laymen who wanted to get schooled in law, right, and that were to pay these masters privately, right? And we're talking at the beginning just of a handful of people that could simply go teaching and learning, I don't know, in a field somewhere in the city, just that spontaneously. There wasn't even initially an actual environment like a building where they learned the stuff. It was all it started all very spontaneously. This makes you understand it very, very clearly, right? In other places, the situations were different. For example, Paris, right? Paris was the most important theological center of Europe at the time. Paris, that was, becoming ever more so a capital of the Capetian kingdom, and that in this sense also had a very high level, had very high aristocracy, and in connection with the monarchical achievements, and that represented some of the most schooled and educated elite of the times, right? And the development of the Paris University, in fact, took the other way around from the one of juridical studies. It was the professors of theology that associated themselves. They were, for the largest part, clergymen, but not only, even in here, right? But the important is that they started it, not the students, right? And these teachers came largely from the main city schools in Paris, chiefly the one of the Cathedral of Notre Dame and of the canonical churches of Sainte Geneviève and Saint Victor. And these teachers were fundamentally concerned with the actually imposant power of the Archbishop's Chancellor, right? So these figures were very, very important because it was the only depository of the power to confer valid diplomas for teaching, the so-called licentia docendi. So here, these masters basically start their own university to kind of parallel this power and to kind of, and it was a successful telling the truth. So the universities once become around the mid 12th century important seats for the intellectual education. They had to deal with the hegemonic attempts of the kind of far and close powers, right? That were interested in what was going on, but they wanted essentially to control this phenomenon and to benefit from it. Like, a university was a great attraction, of course, and not just for the intellectual needs and of education, but for the same fact, like today, that every student consumes, right, and sleeps somewhere, and eats and drinks, and therefore makes the local community richer. So a control and discipline on these centers was necessary, also for other reasons, because this university communities, telling the truth, were pretty tumultuous as well. Like, they created a lot of disorder sometimes, and they needed to be controlled in a way or another. This is what brought eventually even certain universities to essentially be born from detachments of original universities. Some of the most famous and important universities, for example, the one of Padua, that would become one of the most important in Europe, especially in the late Middle Ages. Well, that was a detachment of Bologna, initially speaking. So naturally there were other needs as well, but just for saying that universities were by themselves fairly unstable as groups still, right? And this is very important to understand. And in all likelihood, on the initiative of the students of Bologna, Frederick I Barbarossa released in 1158 the famous Constitution Authentica Habita, right? And through this document, the emperor that was searching for alliances in order to contrast the autonomy of the Italian cities organized in communes, and in the Lombard League that was, opposed to him, granted to the students the privilege not to be judged by the local tribunals that were the ones of the communes and or of the princes, right? The territorial, like the rural lords, but by those tribunals that were presided by the bishops and or by their masters. This is very important because it means that basically the communal jurisdiction over the universities that existed within the city walls, so they were technically part of the community, of the same commune, were now under different jurisdiction that was theoretically the imperial one that granted these rights, right? But more concretely, it was basically a right to self-administration, right? Or a control by the ecclesiastical authorities that were, in that sense, an imperial policy, a way to essentially keep like a non-hereditary authority, like bishops, in fact, and that could be kind of deposed and re-elected. They didn't inherit, in fact, any possession in that regard. In charge of a community that the emperor wanted to make good use of. And the reason why the Holy Roman Emperor was so interested in what was happening there is that the Italian communes were recovering Roman law. And Roman law, so the Justinian Code, stressed the independence of imperial authority from the one of the papacy. So since the clash with the Lombard League was all intertwined with the fact that the papacy backed the Italian rebels, let's say, against the emperor, well, at that point, the emperor had all the reasons and the advantage to essentially back these lawyers that, by the way, were essential to reclaim the imperial rights in Italy by voice. Think about the famous Diet of Roncaglia, in which basically the Holy Roman Emperor comes back in Italy effectively with an army, with an actual force to impose, and reclaims all those rights that over the centuries basically had been lost because German power in Italy had eclipsed itself for a time. So this in turn, you have to think of this picture all framed within, for example, the clash between the papal prerogatives and imperial ones. There was a battle largely fought into the juridical arenas at that point, because it was a matter really of deriving this conceptually natural, hence divine law, and or the imperial secular one that was theoretically one of the Roman Empire. So this developed tremendously, by the way, these local communities, intellectually speaking, because they were, aside, of course, they had the means. These were rich cities. They had their own business on their own. They were developing, in fact, on their own. But it gave them a further reason, while they were pressured by war and by political infight, to develop these new forms of organization at a level that was unknown before, because Roman law had been lost in Europe up to that point. So these rights were quite important, because the universities could either regulate them by themselves, by their own masters, or by the local bishop that normally didn't have at this point any more tremendous power in the city as well, but it was still something different from the commune that ruled the city. In some occasions, and we can't generalize, but it was more or less like that. So in this way, Frederick I satisfied the request of an association that began to suffer those attempts of control of the neighboring powers, but also established a very important precedent to exercise by himself as an emperor a role of reference. This is a policy, for example, that the emperors as well as other sovereigns did Europe-wide. For example, granting, market rights to certain cities, or in the case of the German emperor, specifically the title or the status of free city of the empire. There was a way to say, okay, I grant you these freedoms, and I grant them because I am the emperor. So if you want to maintain these rights, you have to be loyal to me, and therefore opposed naturally to those who are generally more powerful than you, that in Germany were the princely, the territorial princes fundamentally, and therefore you stick to me. This was analyzed that also invested, for example, the clergy, as we have seen here with the example of the Authentica Habita, because generally speaking, the ecclesiastical structures were more loyal to constituted authority than this other local communities, local powers that they were becoming effectively at this point. And there is something similar actually also in countries where these autonomies, differently from the Holy Roman Empire, actually were looser. For example, in the year 1200, the Capetian king Philip II Augustus sought support for its own power. It was already steady, right, and firm, but definitely not unchallenged. Think about the wars with England. Granted to the Parisian students the same exact privilege, accompanied by the same royal protection over the university. As you understand, this is very meaningful. I consider that at the beginning of the 13th century, the Parisian theology faculty was, getting crowded by lots of people, not just all the, lay students and ecclesiastical students, but now a lot also of what would become the mendicant orders fundamentally, that had to seek a formal education, which they didn't have originally speaking, because they weren't part of the ecclesiastical elites before. So a lot of things are changing, and granting the rights to these universities actually means to bring these people from your side, because you know that they can't keep doing what they are already doing by themselves. If you and back you in the process, if you give them green light to do that as an authority, and they will back you in support in turn, right? So that's quite important in general. And even more relevant, in fact, from the first decades of the 13th century, were the papal interventions. These were of dramatic importance. The papacy, as we have seen before, was developing actually its own juridical tradition in a very extremely refined, sophisticated way, and now was starting to regulate also more tightly those, strictly internal ecclesiastical matters, all these problems of the Pauperist-Evangelical movements that had to be framed within the church or repressed if they didn't want that. So, but the Pope at this point enters into a dimension that is also secular, right, and that extends these means to what was in fact secular authorities, right, imperial business, right. The Pope intervened, for example, in those controversy between the universities and local powers themselves, and these were justified, namely, by the necessity of settling of pacification, right? The church, we often forget about this. We think about the church just launching crusades and all, but actually, the papacy had a dramatic role in kind of keeping everything kind of stable, putting an end to internal conflicts. Naturally, they were interested in their own ways, but if a fight broke out, let's say between two cities in Italy, the Pope would say, let's do something to stop this, because Christians shouldn't be killing each other, and we should pacify in general. This was a great problem, because actually it went in parallel with the same needs of the secular authorities. Like, nobody likes unrest, nobody likes destructions, and there is generally a mediation to make things stop. And as we know also from our Clausewitzian studies, let's say that actual total war does not exist. I mean, there is always a way to force politically things to have a peaceful resolution, which ultimately arrives. But this is not to be given for granted in a world where there is actually a pretty weak central power, and warfare is kind of endemic, right? And these contrasts between the communes and the universities were really big problems from the same cities, right? And there were revolts and violences and of all kinds. So it was indispensable to regulate further these communities in order even to secure trade and traffics and so on. Hence, in 1219, Pope Honorius III recognized from one side to the students the right to protest against the Bolognese commune through the practice of the strike, no more, no less, essentially, and also the emigration in other seats, as we have recalled before. But on the other hand, it also affirmed that the only teaching licenses, right, the only valid teaching licenses would have had to be those granted by the archdeacon of the Bolognese church. So you see here that basically the Pope intervenes through the local clergy to basically tie the teaching license to the same ecclesiastical approval. This is quite of an interference, right? So you understand that this was actually a struggle for controlling these communities from whichever side you were, and in this sense, he exchanged his own help with the interference of the commune, with the recognition of a power that was to himself subdued, basically. And in Paris, the migration of the students in 1229, that was originated by the condemnations emanated by the chancellors against some of those at least, gave life to a conflict in which Pope Gregory IX intervened, right? And the Pope, with the bull Parens Scientiarum, which means the Mother of Sciences, of 1231, redesigned the university organization by affirming its autonomy from the chancellor, from civilian authorities and from the mendicant orders that in the past had attempted to hegemonize it. So once again, this is a very valid mean essentially to structure papal power, essentially through exploiting certain intellectual forces that wanted to be essentially free or regulated, but still within an environment they could do whatever they wanted. So it was obvious that in the face of the growth of these communities, there was a great problem also in, stemming them if you weren't a consistent power locally speaking, and some other, superior powers could at that point kind of patronize these initiatives and to secure their rights that were recognized now by the same church. So it's not by the same Roman church, which is not a few. So the model offered by these first spontaneous universities was eventually taken in loan, we can say, and in a certain sense denaturated from its principles, right? Among the attempts of this kind that constituted the most clear expression of the will to control the new transmission of knowledge as well, is the foundation of the University of Naples in 1224 by initiative of Frederick II of Swabia. That was intentioned to endow his Sicilian kingdom with a school, right, for the education of the functionaries. This is another very important university, but the story around it is particular. It's a bit different from the other. This is not a university that is born, for example, from previous studia, as they were called eventually, the studium, the place where they studied properly. Naples was a substantially developed city, especially as a trade center, but it didn't have the same degree of autonomy that northern cities in Italy had. On the other hand, so the southern kingdom was somewhat feudalized, so that's partly of the reason also why there weren't such large local political autonomies. And at the same time, the Swabians, Frederick II in particular, have worked a lot essentially to build from here kind of a more centralized rule of the Kingdom of Sicily, because Germany was lost to him basically. He granted in there lots of freedoms and autonomies and central power in Germany basically failed at that point. He is Frederick's grandfather. Frederick Barbarossa himself was the one who got closer to create a national monarchy like the French or the English were doing. So Sicily now was the next option, and Frederick II worked as hell to give it an adequate centralization. And in fact, in juridical terms, this activity was very important because we have, in the only case in Western medieval law, with the Melfi constitutions, the only case of essentially a king, at that point really a king, because Frederick was Holy Roman Emperor, but at that point he did this as Sicilian king, to emanate laws essentially out of his own authority, which was completely inconceivable in European medieval customary law. It was, the local communities basically elected the king, or at least authorized the king to rule or confirm them, legitimized him, as long as he just protected their local customs. And it wasn't allowed for a king to make a law on its own and to impose it on his community. It didn't work. Right, they didn't have the political power to do that in the Middle Ages, where the Melfi constitutions are the actually only case of this, albeit, laws that were created, theoretically at least, from a juridical point of view, to fill those legal vacuums, essentially, that needed to be filled with further legislation. And this is important because at that point, in order to achieve a centralization, you needed a skilled personnel, right, functionaries that already existed in the Sicilian kingdom, but that needed essentially an independence at that point from the great universities of the north, because also in the Sicilian kingdom, normally people had to go to northern Italy to learn law at Bologna. So Frederick II creates his own university to avoid and actually even to forbid local students to go study elsewhere, right? And eventually these were centers of great importance. Like southern Italy had, for example, one of the most important, if not the most important, school of medicine in Christian Middle Ages. That was the Salernitan school. That was, however, not a university. Eventually, I think, was elevated to that grade. But let's say that it was a place full of knowledge, a crossroad between the Christian, the Muslim, the Jewish world. But at the same time, they lacked what the kind of more autonomously and civilly advanced centers of the North had acquired, right, on their own. And in this decree of foundation, in fact, of institution of the studium in Naples, the emperor promised great benefits to the students of the Kingdom of Sicily that would have chosen to attend it, and established very heavy punishments for those who had emigrated in order to study elsewhere. So naturally, this was a threat for the ancient Bolognese university, that was by far the most famous and important and power, that was in fact explicitly remembered in the Act of Foundation, but of the University of Naples in this regard, but also designed, on the other hand, that the system of learning that was born and had been born and developed in Bologna now constituted an inescapable reality for the intellectual promotion of the ruling class, right? This is eventually, and the Southern Kingdom didn't manage to match the development of the Bolognese school. But this shows you also the attempt of a determined sovereign like Frederick II to try to counter this, to essentially conglomerate, agglutinate around Naples, a community of, an intelligentsia substantially that could, at that point, compare in a way or another with Bologna. That remained, however, the model, right? This is, I think, an important part to start from, and I think the more we go on, the more we will, the deeper, let's say, we will go in these topics, because actually the history of medieval law is dramatically fascinating, overlooked, and very often poorly taught, in my opinion. If you look, it's people tendentially either study it from, legal students normally study from Roman law and directly through the modern age, but therefore medieval law is kind of summarized in pretty approximative ways, and usually treated as an example of how central power was weakened here. Haha, that sucks. These were barbarians, right? And this is absolutely doesn't take into consideration the enormous amount of development that this law had for society, and how well it worked for those in that specific context. And this is in fact what we are basically finding out day after day, that these laws were dramatically sophisticated, and that the lack of centralization requires that by definition. And these laws did work. Who believes that the Middle Ages were a world of anarchy where people, just there was no law, everybody did whatever they wanted? It's actually not true. There was a lot of autonomy, a lot of decentralization, but actually it was exactly through law that an attempt of reorganization passed through, and law, that the one was made, didn't remain, dead on paper, we can say at this time, but it went beyond. It became something, if it was emanated, because it worked in a way that was needed to be employed, and that's also why, for example, jurists acquired this enormous prestige. socially speaking, because they were people who were equated essentially to knights, as they received knighthood, just as the knights, literally, because they were considered fundamental for making these, let's call them states in an anachronistic way, work, right? And they managed to do so, and that's why a kingdom could not do without universities, and why there was this enormous competition between all, even the universal powers, to actually extend protection in this and that center, because that could mean a lot more of personnel and of trained experts on this specific juridical fields that were necessary also for the same administration. I mean, it was not just a strictly legal problem, it was needing to find people who knew how to make things work, also practically speaking. And telling the truth, from the 13th century, especially second half of the 13th century onwards, it would be the papacy and the French Angevins that would dominate in this field, and creating effectively real bureaucracy, right? Bureaucracy was not born in the 18th century. Bureaucracy, by many standards in the Western Europe, is born in the 14th century by the popes and the French kings, right? They were working together for it, and it was dramatically sophisticated. They produced an enormous amount of documentation, enormous to say the least, and this all because they had to make work an enormous empire that stretched from the Channel to Turkey, basically, and they had to make it work effectively, and they managed that. So they pulled it off. So it's very important to not to relegate these stories to just, oh, look at here, there was this university, it was cool, it was founded in this year, look at how old it is, and that's it. You have to understand what's behind that and why it worked. And here we're talking about brutal stories, and don't think that there was war here. There were bloodsheds, there were serious, massively serious political problems in this moment. So these people were called to give an answer that could really settle a lot of matters, that could really change a lot, could really make a difference. And you could argue that eventually this attempt to to fully regulate the whole, with a universalistic aim, also ended in the sense that in the mid 13th century, as you know, universalism died in a word and another. So, but at the same time, this granted the proliferation of many universities, especially in areas where, for example, in Central Europe, even in Northern Europe, some point that had remained relatively marginal up to this point. That reflects, in fact, what Europe would evolve like in a substantially politically fragmented, but still locally very functional and diverse in this sense form of organization, and different even juridical schools and traditions, and that we have been discussing now on Schwerpunkt from quite some times. Some days ago, I made a video about, for example, the Mos Gallicus, Roman law in France, 15th to 16th century, this end of the Middle Ages. That, for example, witnesses the in the mid 15th century of the emergence of a different humanistic juridical philosophy, let's say, that was born even in places like Florence in France, and that detached itself from the dominant Bolognese current that had remained by far prevalent up to that point, right? Okay, we could talk endlessly about this topic, because I had a bit of lack of studying it when I was at university, and I at the beginning I thought it was boring. Then I got fairly in love with that, even if I never actually completely immersed myself into. But let's say it's much wider and much more thought-provoking than the usual story of universities popping out around Europe for the sake of it, right? Alright, so for now we stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like, or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.